They called him a fake veteran at the court. Then a furious general walked in. Honor isn't given, it's earned in blood and sacrifice. These words echoed through courtroom 7 as Harold Jenkins, a 72-year-old man with stooped shoulders and weathered hands, stood before Judge Michaels. The charge stolen valor and fraud for wearing military decorations he allegedly never earned, including the Distinguished Service Cross and Purple Heart. The prosecution painted a damning picture, a con man who for decades had claimed to be a Vietnam War hero, receiving veterans' benefits and speaking at schools about his experiences in combat. The evidence seemed overwhelming. Military records showing discrepancies, testimony from veterans organizations that had investigated him, and the Department of Defense's statement that no Harold Jenkins had received the medals he displayed so proudly. Jenkins, representing himself after his court-appointed attorney withdrew, maintained a dignified silence throughout most of the proceedings. His only statement, "I served my country honorably, that's all I have to say." The small courtroom was packed with spectators, many of them veterans themselves, their faces set in hard lines of disgust. In the front row sat Richard Donnelly, the local VFW commander who had initiated the investigation after becoming suspicious of Jenkins's stories during a Memorial Day ceremony. Beside him was Congressman James Ward, who had built his political career on veterans issues and had publicly condemned Jenkins before the trial even began. What no one in that courtroom knew was that the quiet, unassuming man standing alone at the defendant's table had secrets that went far beyond what any of them could imagine, and that the truth was about to walk through the door in the form of a 3-star general with fire in his eyes. The prosecution calls Mr. Victor Ramirez, announced District Attorney Sarah Collins, a sharp-featured woman whose ambition for higher office was well known throughout the county. Ramirez, the president of a local veterans organization, took the stand with military bearing. His silver hair was cut in a precise crew cut, and his navy blazer bore the pins of a man who had served honorably in Vietnam. "Mr. Ramirez, please tell the court about your investigation into the defendant," Collins prompted. "We began investigating Mr. Jenkins 3 years ago after inconsistencies in his stories raised red flags. When we requested his military records through proper channels, what we found was disturbing." "Please elaborate," Collins prompted. "The records show a Harold Jenkins who served, yes, but as a supply clerk who never left Fort Benning. No combat deployment, no medal certainly, no Distinguished Service Cross." Ramirez's voice hardened. "Men died earning those medals, real heroes. What Mr. Jenkins has done dishonors their sacrifice." Throughout this testimony, Jenkins remained impassive, his eyes focused on some middle distance as if seeing something no one else could. The only sign of emotion was a slight tightening of his jaw when Ramirez mentioned real heroes. "Did you confront the defendant with your findings?" Collins asked. "Yes, at a VFW meeting. He claimed there must be some mistake, that his records were classified. Classic excuse used by fakers." Ramirez's contempt was palpable. When pressed, he simply walked out. Judge Michaels turned to Jenkins. "Mr. Jenkins, do you wish to cross-examine this witness?" Jenkins rose slowly, the weight of his years evident in each movement. "Just one question." He faced Ramirez directly. "Did you request my records under service number 11-548-7239J?" Ramirez blinked, consulting his notes. "We requested them under your Social Security number, as is standard procedure." Jenkins nodded as if this confirmed something. No further questions. The prosecution continued building its case throughout the morning. A military records specialist testified about the absence of Jenkins' name on the Distinguished Service Cross recipient list. A VA administrator detailed the benefits Jenkins had received over the years based on his claimed service record. A former high school principal described how Jenkins had spoken to students about combat experiences that, according to official records, he never had. The children looked up to him, she said, her voice breaking slightly. They wrote him thank you letters for his service. By noon, the case against Harold Jenkins seemed airtight. The spectators, many of them veterans themselves who had come to see justice served against a man they viewed as a fraud, exchanged satisfied glances. Judge Michaels called a lunch recess, and as the courtroom began to empty, Jenkins remained seated, pulling a faded photograph from his wallet and staring at it with an expression of profound sadness. "That won't help you, you know," said D.A. Collins as she gathered her papers. "Whatever story you're planning to tell this afternoon, the records don't lie." Jenkins looked up at her, his eyes suddenly sharp and clear. "No, they don't lie, Ms. Collins. But sometimes they don't tell the whole truth either." When court reconvened, Jenkins was given the opportunity to present his defense. The gallery leaned forward, anticipating excuses or perhaps a plea for leniency. Instead, Jenkins approached the bench with a quiet dignity that seemed at odds with the broken man they'd seen that morning. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter these items into evidence." He called no witnesses. Instead, he simply placed 3 items on the evidence table, a set of dog tags so worn the embossing was barely legible, a faded green notebook with water-damaged pages, and a small wooden box. "Your Honor," he began, his voice stronger than it had been all day, "I've listened to everyone explain who I am not. Perhaps it's time I explain who I am." He held up the dog tags. "These were issued to me in 1968 when I was recruited from basic training into a special program. The name and numbers match no official record because they weren't meant to." Collins rose immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. The defendant is making unsubstantiated claims." "I'm explaining the evidence I've presented," Jenkins countered calmly. Judge Michaels considered for a moment. "I'll allow it, but stick to explaining these specific items, Mr. Jenkins." Jenkins nodded and opened the water-damaged notebook. "This contains notes from my time in country, coordinates, names of contacts, mission parameters. It's written in a code we developed. The water damage happened during extraction across the Mekong River in 1969. He turned to the small wooden box. "And this contains what matters most." He opened it, revealing a key. "This opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank. Inside are my real military records. I would like to request a court order to retrieve those documents." D.A. Collins immediately objected. "Your Honor, this is clearly a delay tactic. If such records existed, they would be with the Department of Defense, which has already provided documentation." Judge Michaels frowned. "Mr. Jenkins, why would your military records be in a private safety deposit box rather than with the proper authorities?" Jenkins looked directly at the judge for the first time. "Because, Your Honor, according to the United States government, Harold Jenkins died in Laos in 1970. A murmur ran through the courtroom. The judge banged his gavel. "Order, Mr. Jenkins, are you now claiming identity theft or impersonation?" "No, Your Honor. I'm claiming that some missions don't exist on paper. Some soldiers don't exist on paper until they need someone to blame. The courtroom doors swung open with a bang that made everyone turn. In the doorway stood a tall figure in a crisp dress uniform adorned with 3 stars, a Lieutenant General of the United States Army. His face was a thundercloud as he strode down the center aisle flanked by 2 military police officers. "General Marcus Blackwood, United States Army," he announced in a voice accustomed to command, "and this proceeding ends now." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Judge Michaels banged his gavel repeatedly. "General, this is my courtroom. You will explain yourself or be held in contempt." General Blackwood reached the front of the courtroom, standing between Jenkins and the prosecution table. "Your Honor, I'm here under the authority of the Secretary of Defense. This case involves classified information that cannot be tried in open court." D.A. Collins was on her feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The prosecution has not been notified of any federal interest in this case." "Because there isn't supposed to be any federal interest, Counselor," Blackwood replied coldly. "That's rather the point of classified operations." He turned to Jenkins, his expression softening slightly. "You should have called us Harold." Jenkins met his gaze steadily. "Would you have answered, sir?" The general had no response to that. From the gallery, Congressman Ward pushed his way to the front. "General Blackwood, I sit on the Armed Services Committee. I demand to know what's going on here." Blackwood barely spared him a glance. "Congressman, with all due respect, your clearance level isn't high enough for this conversation." Ward's face flushed red. "How dare you? I've championed veterans' causes for 20 years. "And yet," Jenkins said quietly, "you were quick to condemn me without knowing the full story. Seems like a pattern with politicians." Judge Michaels, regaining control of his courtroom, addressed Blackwood. "General, I need more than vague references to classified information. This court has proper procedures for handling sensitive matters. With respect, Your Honor, this goes beyond standard classification." Blackwood handed the judge a sealed envelope. "These are my credentials and a letter from the Secretary of Defense. I request a private meeting in your chambers with you, the defendant, and the district attorney." Judge Michaels examined the documents, his expression growing increasingly grave. Finally, he looked up. "Court is in recess for 1 hour. Ms. Collins, Mr. Jenkins, you'll join me and General Blackwood in my chambers immediately." As they filed out, the spectators buzzed with speculation. The veterans who had come to see Jenkins condemned now watched in confusion as he walked out alongside a 3-star general who seemed to know him well. In the judge's chambers, General Blackwood wasted no time. "Harold Jenkins served under me in a special operations unit designated MACV SOG. Their missions in Laos and Cambodia were strictly classified officially. American troops were never there." "That doesn't explain the discrepancies in his record," Collins argued. "Doesn't it?" Blackwood countered. "Members of certain SOG teams operated under cover identities. If captured, the U.S. could disavow any knowledge of their activities. Some, like Jenkins, were officially listed as supply clerks who never left stateside bases. Others were listed as killed in action in Vietnam, even if they actually fell in countries we weren't supposed to be in." He turned to Jenkins. "In 1970, Harold's team was compromised during an operation in Laos. 3 men died. Harold and another operative escaped, but the mission was a political disaster waiting to happen. The decision was made at the highest levels to erase the operation completely. "They listed me as killed in action in Vietnam," Jenkins said quietly. "Gave a flag to my parents. Meanwhile, I was recovering from wounds in a facility that didn't exist, being debriefed by people without names." When it was over, Blackwood continued, Jenkins was given a new identity and civilian credentials. He was thanked for his service and told never to speak of what he'd done for his country. "And the medals?" Judge Michaels asked. "Earned, but never officially awarded," Blackwood replied. "The Distinguished Service Cross was approved through channels that were later disavowed. The Purple Heart was for wounds received in a country we weren't in. The paperwork was destroyed." Collins looked stunned. "Are you saying the United States government essentially erased this man's service?" "I'm saying," Blackwood replied carefully, "that sometimes national security requires difficult decisions. Jenkins and men like him were caught in political crossfire as much as enemy crossfire." Judge Michaels turned to Jenkins. "Why come forward now? Why risk exposure after all these years?" Jenkins sighed heavily. "My wife died last year. Cancer. With her gone and no children, I started thinking about legacy, about truth. I didn't want to die with no one knowing who I really was, what I really did." He looked at Blackwood. "I never claimed medals I didn't earn. I just couldn't explain how I earned them." "The government owes you better," Blackwood acknowledged. "That's why I'm here." When court reconvened, the atmosphere had transformed. D.A. Collins addressed the judge, her voice subdued. "Your Honor, in light of new information provided by General Blackwood, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Jenkins." Judge Michaels nodded. "Motion granted. Mr. Jenkins, you are free to go. This court offers its apologies for the ordeal you've endured." As Jenkins gathered his few possessions, General Blackwood approached the bench. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I have one more matter to address." With the judge's approval, Blackwood turned to face the gallery. "Many of you came here today believing you were supporting the integrity of military service. That's commendable. But today, you've witnessed firsthand how appearances can be deceiving and how quick judgments can be wrong." He moved to stand beside Jenkins. "By order of the President of the United States, I am here to correct a 50-year-old injustice." From his aide, Blackwood received a polished wooden case. Opening it, he revealed the Distinguished Service Cross, one of the nation's highest military honors. "Harold Jenkins," he announced formally, "for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy, for selfless courage under fire, and for service above and beyond the call of duty. It is my honor to officially present you with the Distinguished Service Cross, too long delayed, but never forgotten." The courtroom, so recently filled with condemnation for Jenkins, fell completely silent as Blackwood pinned the medal to the old man's lapel. Then, with perfect military precision, the general stepped back and saluted. Jenkins, his back straightening, as if shedding years of burden, returned the salute with perfect form. One by one, the veterans in the gallery stood, hands raised to foreheads in silent salute to a brother they had wrongly judged. Richard Donnelly, the VFW commander who had started the investigation, approached Jenkins with tears in his eyes. "I don't know what to say except I'm sorry." Jenkins regarded him for a moment, then extended his hand. "You did what you thought was right to protect the honor of the service. I can't fault you for that." Congressman Ward, however, remained seated, his expression unreadable. When Jenkins caught his eye, the politician quickly looked away. After the ceremony, as the courtroom cleared, Jenkins found himself surrounded by veterans eager to hear his story, what parts of it he could tell. Among them was a young reporter from the local paper, notebook in hand. "Mr. Jenkins," she asked, "how does it feel to finally be recognized after all these years?" Jenkins considered the question carefully. "Recognition isn't why I served. None of us did. But being called a fraud, a liar, that cut deep. Today isn't about medals. It's about truth." General Blackwood, overhearing, added, "and justice, long overdue." The reporter turned to Blackwood. "General, why now? Why did it take a criminal trial to bring this to light?" Blackwood's expression darkened. "Bureaucracy, politics, the same forces that buried these men's sacrifices in the first place. But make no mistake, this isn't just about Harold Jenkins. There are others like him, their service hidden in classified files, their sacrifices unacknowledged." "Will they receive recognition too?" the reporter pressed. "That," Blackwood said, glancing at Congressman Ward, who was slipping out a side door, "depends on whether our elected officials value truth over political expediency." The story broke the next morning under the headline, "Hero Vindicated: The Secret War of Harold Jenkins." The article detailed what little could be revealed about Jenkins' service and the government's decades-long silence. By noon, it had been picked up by national news outlets. Jenkins found himself thrust into an unexpected spotlight. His phone rang constantly with interview requests, offers for book deals, and messages from veterans across the country. Some shared similar stories of classified missions and unacknowledged service. Others simply wanted to apologize for doubting him. 3 days after the trial, Jenkins received a visitor at his modest home, Congressman Ward, without his usual entourage of aides and photographers. "May I come in?" Ward asked, looking uncomfortable on the porch. Jenkins studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. "Coffee's on." Ward followed him into the small living room where framed photographs, mostly of Jenkins with his late wife, lined the walls. One shelf held a single picture of 5 young men in jungle fatigues, their faces dirty but smiling. "Your team?" Ward asked, nodding toward the photo. "What's left of them?" Jenkins replied, handing Ward a mug of black coffee. 3 died in Laos. The other one?" He paused. "Well, I lost track of him after they separated us for debriefing." Ward sat awkwardly on the edge of the sofa. "Mr. Jenkins, I came to apologize. I jumped to conclusions without having all the facts." Jenkins settled into his armchair with a slight wince, an old wound acting up. "Apology accepted, though I suspect you're here for more than that." Ward had the grace to look embarrassed. "The Armed Services Committee is convening a special hearing on veterans with classified service records. General Blackwood has been pushing for a systematic review of cases like yours, men whose records were altered or buried for national security reasons." "And you want me to testify," Jenkins concluded. "Your story has resonated with people. It could help others in your situation." Jenkins sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Funny how last week I was a fraud and this week I'm a poster boy for veterans' rights." "Politics moves quickly," Ward admitted. "Too quickly for truth sometimes." Jenkins set down his mug. "I'll testify on one condition. This can't be about scoring political points. These men, my brothers, deserve better than to be pawns in Washington games." Ward nodded solemnly. "You have my word." After the congressman left, Jenkins sat alone staring at the Distinguished Service Cross now displayed in a simple frame on his mantel. Beside it lay a stack of letters that had arrived that morning, messages from veterans and civilians alike, some apologizing for doubting him, others sharing their own stories of unacknowledged service. One letter in particular caught his attention. The handwriting was shaky, the return address from a VA hospital in Phoenix. Jenkins opened it carefully. "Harold," it began, "I saw you on the news. It's been 50 years, but I'd know that face anywhere. They told me you died in that valley. I've carried that weight all these years. If you're really alive, if this isn't some cruel joke, call the number below. Your brother in arms, Michael Tanner." Jenkins' hands trembled. Michael Tanner, the fifth man in the photograph, the one he'd lost track of after their mission went sideways, the one who dragged him bleeding and barely conscious across the Laotian border. He reached for the phone. 2 weeks later, Harold Jenkins sat before the House Armed Services Committee television cameras, broadcasting his testimony nationwide. Beside him sat Michael Tanner, now frail from years battling illnesses linked to Agent Orange exposure, but his eyes still sharp and alert. "Gentlemen," began the committee chair, "we're here today to address a grave injustice that has persisted for decades. Mr. Jenkins, please proceed with your statement." Jenkins leaned toward the microphone. "I'm not here to seek personal recognition or compensation. I'm here for the men who can't speak for themselves, those who died in countries we weren't supposed to be in, fighting battles that officially never happened." He detailed the system that had erased their service, the classified missions, the cover identities, the political decisions that had buried their sacrifices beneath layers of bureaucracy and denial. "When I returned home," Jenkins continued, "I was told to forget what I'd done, who I'd been. But how do you forget the men who died beside you? How do you explain nightmares about places you supposedly never went? How do you seek treatment for wounds that officially don't exist?" The room was silent as Jenkins described the decades that followed the struggle to access veterans' benefits without revealing classified information, the suspicion from other veterans when his stories didn't match official records, the isolation of carrying a truth he couldn't share. "The worst part wasn't the physical pain or the nightmares," he said quietly. "It was being called a liar for telling the truth." Michael Tanner spoke next, his voice weak but determined. "I spent 30 years believing I'd failed to save Harold Jenkins. His name is on the wall in D.C. I visited it every year to apologize for leaving him behind. Now I learn he's been alive all this time, fighting the same battles I've fought, to be recognized, to be believed, to have our service acknowledged." General Blackwood presented the committee with declassified documents showing the extent of the problem, hundreds, perhaps thousands of veterans whose records had been altered or buried for various reasons. Classified operations, political sensitivities, administrative errors. "These men served honorably," Blackwood stated firmly. "They bled for their country. They deserve better than to be treated as frauds or fantasists when they speak the truth about their service." Congressman Ward, who had orchestrated the hearing, addressed Jenkins directly. "Mr. Jenkins, what would justice look like to you and others in your situation?" Jenkins exchanged glances with Tanner before answering. "Justice would be a systematic review of classified service records. Justice would be a presumption of truth rather than suspicion when veteran stories don't match official records. Justice would be acknowledging that sometimes our government's need for secrecy has come at too high a cost for those who served. The hearing lasted for hours, with testimony from military historians, VA administrators, and other veterans with similar stories. Throughout it all, Jenkins sat straight-backed and dignified, the Distinguished Service Cross pinned to his lapel catching the light of the television cameras. When it was over, as Jenkins and Tanner made their way slowly through the Capitol corridors, they were stopped by a group of young soldiers in dress uniform. "Sir," said one, stepping forward, "we just wanted to shake your hand. What you did today matters to all of us." Jenkins looked at these young men and women, seeing in them echoes of himself and his team. 5 decades earlier, the same idealism, the same commitment to service. "Just remember," he told them, "the uniform you wear, the oath you took, they're to the Constitution, not to any administration or policy. Your honor is in how you serve, not in how that service is recognized." As the young soldiers saluted and moved on, Tanner gripped Jenkins' arm. 50 years too late, but we finally completed the mission, didn't we?" Jenkins nodded. "Bringing everyone home, even if only in spirit." 3 months later, Harold Jenkins stood before a different audience, students at Westridge High School's Veterans Day Assembly. No longer hiding in the shadows of classified operations, he spoke carefully about the parts of his service he could share, about honor duty and the complicated nature of serving a country that sometimes couldn't publicly acknowledge that service. In the front row sat General Blackwood in civilian clothes alongside D.A. Collins, whose initial prosecution had transformed into a campaign to help veterans with classified service histories navigate the bureaucratic maze to receive their proper recognition. "Honor isn't given," Jenkins told the students, echoing the words that had opened his trial. "It's earned in blood and sacrifice. But sometimes the greatest honor is knowing the truth yourself, even when no one else does." The Veterans Classified Service Recognition Act, already being called the Jenkins Act by the media, had passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. It established a special review board to examine cases like his, created new protocols for veterans with classified service histories to access benefits without compromising national security, and allocated funds for outreach to identify others who might be suffering in silence. Most importantly to Jenkins, it included provisions for adding the names of those who died in classified operations to the memorials honoring their sacrifices, even if the full circumstances of their deaths remained classified. After the assembly, as students gathered around to ask questions, a young girl approached Jenkins shyly. "My grandfather was in Vietnam," she said. "He doesn't talk about it much, but sometimes he mentions places that aren't in his official records. Could he be like you?" Jenkins knelt to meet her at eye level, wincing slightly at the pain in his knees. "It's possible. Many men served in ways that aren't fully documented. But what matters isn't where he served, it's that he served at all. That's worth honoring." As the crowd thinned, a young student approached with a final question. "If you had to do it all over again, knowing you wouldn't get recognition, knowing some would even call you a fraud, would you still serve?" Jenkins looked at Blackwood, then back to the student. "In a heartbeat. Because I didn't serve for the medals or the recognition. I served for the man beside me, for the country behind me, and for the future before me." He gestured to the students. "Your future." Later that evening, Jenkins visited the local VFW post, the same one that had once investigated him as a fraud. Now he was an honored guest. Richard Donnelly, who had led that investigation, had become one of his strongest advocates, working tirelessly to identify other veterans with similar stories. "We've found 17 just in this county," Donnelly told him as they shared a quiet drink. "Men who've been carrying these secrets for decades, afraid to speak up for fear of being called liars." "And now?" Jenkins asked. "Now they're coming forward. Your courage gave them permission to tell their truth." As Jenkins prepared to leave, he paused by the wall of photographs, generations of local veterans from World War II to Afghanistan. A new section had been added, Classified Operations, Service Honored. His photograph hung there alongside Michael Tanner's and 3 others recently identified. Below them was a simple inscription: "Not all battles are recorded in history books. Not all heroes are named in official records, but all who serve with honor deserve to be remembered." Outside, the evening was cool and clear, stars spreading across the sky like distant witnesses to both the public and secret histories of humanity. Jenkins stood for a moment, remembering nights in Laos, when those same stars had been his only companions, his only constants in a world of shifting truths and classified realities. A car pulled up, and Michael Tanner rolled down the window. "Need a ride, old man?" Jenkins smiled. "Thought you'd never ask." As they drove through the quiet streets of the town that had once condemned him and now celebrated him, Jenkins reflected on the strange journey that had brought him here, from classified operative to suspected fraud to vindicated hero. "You know what's funny?" he said to Tanner. "For 50 years, I was exactly who I always said I was. The only thing that changed was what other people believed." Tanner nodded thoughtfully. "Truth is like that sometimes. It doesn't change, but our willingness to see it does." "Honor isn't given." Jenkins repeated the words that had once been an accusation, now transformed into a hard-won truth. "It's earned in blood and sacrifice, and sometimes the greatest sacrifice is silence." But now at last that silence was broken, not just for Harold Jenkins, but for all those who had served in the shadows, their sacrifices unacknowledged, their honor questioned. The truth so long classified was finally coming to light. And for an old soldier who had carried the weight of unspoken history for 50 years, that was recognition enough.